Yo, JD here, and as you can see, we are back on F123, and in today's video, a little bit of an overdue one, but we are going to be talking about how setups work on F123. This is something I like to do every single year, and I will try and make this video as short and concise and simplified as possible. Please let me know if you enjoyed this. If you'd like me to go into even more detail on each aspect of the setup, different components, then I can do dedicated videos on that. But thank you so much for watching, and please like the video if you have found this useful. So if we go straight into the setup right now, this is actually my race setup that I'm running for Bahrain, and you have different components of the setup. So you have the aerodynamics, transmission, suspension geometry, suspension, brakes, and tires. Typically, when it comes to building a setup, a pretty good baseline is actually to start in time trial. I think especially F123, a lot of the time trial setups are actually quite usable online, and that really is down to your ability to control the car, the understanding of the fundamentals, how smooth you are, your experience. But I think actually just downloading a legit world record time trial setup is actually normally going to put you in good stead. But I have made some modifications to my setup. Again, this is one I ran in a league race recently, and it was pretty successful. So we'll go through each part, explain it as best as we can, and let's go ahead and do this. So if you move on to the aerodynamics, on this game we have 0 to 50, which is something that's a little bit different from the previous games. Typically you want the front wing to be higher than the rear wing. There are a few tracks such as perhaps like Baku and some others on the calendar where you might run equal, if not the front wing a little bit lower, but typically you want the wings to have this kind of structure where the front aero is higher than the rear. Main reason for that is because it will make the front end a little bit more responsive. I like to have the wings a little bit lower than I have in the time trial. I think normally in time trial it's around 40, 35, so bring them a little bit closer together, create a little bit more stability, but a lower wing setting. And having lower wings is going to create less drag, which means it's going to be faster in a straight line. However, this will create slightly worse tyre wear, but quite significantly, and one of the main reasons why I do this is that it creates a better ERS saving ability, as the engine does not have to work as hard. And this means you can save more ERS per lap when you're not using it. You're going to be faster in a straight line. That's something that is very, very significant considering how powerful the overtake button is. If you decided to make these wings higher, so both of these higher, it's going to be slower in a straight line, but it is going to have a little bit better tyre wear, but not as good at saving the battery. So typically this is what I advise for the aero. And jumping into a time trial, you'll go get a pretty good indication of what these wings should be. They're normally within 5 to 10 clicks of what the aero is on a time trial. That's typically going to work quite well online as well. As we move over to the transmission, in my opinion, you don't really want to be going above 60% for both of the on throttle and the off throttle. I have seen a lot of setup recommendations out there from people who are running 70, 75, and for me that is absolutely crazy. I don't think you'll be finding a competitive setup where it is above 60% on both. And to get an understanding of how this works, and basically the higher you go, the more towards the locked. This is where both wheels will be working together. So try and imagine that you're in an airplane, you have an engine on each side. 100% locked means that when there's full thrust, both engines are going to receive the same amount of power. And on this F1 game, if you raise this, so the on throttle up to 57 or 60, what that's going to do is that it's going to give you better traction potential. So both of the wheels are going to have the same power distribution put into them, which means potentially a better exit. However, it is going to create more understeer on the exits of corners because both wheels are moving towards at the same time. However, if you do have a bit of a wheel spin moment, it's going to be making it much harder to control the car because one wheel can't kind of counteract the other if you make a bit of a mistake. On this game, traction is quite, not well, it's a lot easier than 22, but the traction potential is just not worth it. It makes it a lot more inconsistent. So typically, you see most people running around 55 and then below, because then if you went lower, what that's going to do is it might not create as much traction potential, but it's going to give you more rotation. So if you're going through a right-hander, hairpin, that's a right-hander, you're going on the power during the corner, running this a little bit lower is actually going to make the left-hand side of the car have a little bit more power for the wheels, which is then going to help give you more rotation when you're going on that power. However, sometimes that might be a little bit too much rotation, and also it's going to make it a little bit more oversteery on the exits of the corners. However, it will make it easier to catch a wheel spin moment because both wheels are moving a little bit more independently from each other. So higher you go, more traction potential, more understeer, the harder it is. The lower you go, the less traction potential, the more rotation, but the easier it is to control. And this is applied to the off throttle as well. They both work in exactly the same way. And with the off throttle, obviously the name off throttle, it's when you're not using the brakes, you're not using the throttle. And if you're going through a corner and you're coasting, 50% is going to give you the most rotation possible. But if you find that sometimes a little bit too much rotation, so if you go from a qualifying, this is something you can change between qualifying and a race, even part time when it's on. If you find that it is over rotating a bit, you can simply raise this. Both wheels are going to be rotating a bit more at the same time, which is going to push the car forward, creating a little bit more understeer, creating a little bit more stability. So these are the things that you can change. When we get to the suspension geometry, if you want me to be completely honest, I'm not going to really be spending too much detail on this, and please correct me if I'm wrong if I say anything in this. Typically, the right, left is actually going to be working really, really well on this game. The other combination that seems to be quite successful is also this minus 2.8, minus 1, 0.04, and 0.14. The right, left, I haven't really found a huge difference between them. Really, the best way to explain this, and again, I'm not pretending to be an expert, this is simply what I feel during the game. So there's a lot of time where the explanations don't really match what's actually happening in the game. It's not always completely realistic. But right, left is really the most stable combination you can have. So all the way to the right for the cambers, that's going to create the most stability on the front part and the rear part of the car. If you want a bit more response from the front end, then you would lower this. So instead of going all the way to the right, that's why this is a little bit lowered. It's going to create a little bit more response on the entry to the corner whilst the rear is still stable. Whereas if you were all the way to the left here, if you wanted a bit more response going into the corner, but it's not really so much going into the corner for the toe. In my opinion, it's more about during the corner. So it works very similar to how the anti-roll bar works. So the cambers, I would describe them of how the front and rear suspension work. The toes are really how quite a similar effect to how the roll bars work. So the roll bar for me is really when you're at that maximum load during the corner, the maximum speed, the maximum grip you're carrying through a corner, how it changes direction, can it still hang on to that grip? So if you want a little bit more grip going into the high speed corners, then you would simply raise this. But again, I feel right, left is a pretty good compromise to be using and works very well. But again, if you want me to explain it a little bit more, go into making a dedicated video on this, then please just let me know. Now we move to the suspension, which is quite an important part of the setup. And with these setups, just to make it clear, there is no such thing as a perfect setup. It really is down to your ability, down to your experience, and you can't have the perfect balance for every single corner. You've got to really try and think of it as if it's an orchestra, like you're playing in a band. There's a bass, there's a treble, there's the vocals. You want them to try and complement each other. So some parts of the set might be quite oversteery, might be quite responsive, but then you kind of got to counteract that with other parts of the setup to make it a little bit more stable. And if we're coming through into suspension, the roll bar and ride height, I like to separate these into two. So the front and rear suspension is one thing, the front anti-roll bar and the rear anti-roll bar is another, and then the front ride height and the rear ride height. If we're going into suspension, It's quite similar to really kind of how the camber is for me. If you want the most stable combination, it's going to be 41-1. The front and rear kind of work in opposites. If you want the most oversteer, the most rotation, the most responsive combination of this, then you'd be going for 1 and 41. It's exactly the same for the roll bar as well. They both work in the same way. On this game, you'll typically find that the front suspension and the front roll bar will pretty much 99% of the time always be higher than the rear. Because in this game, with the regulations of the cars and how the handling works, it's quite easy to over-rotate the car. So this is why you want the front part of the car to be a little bit more stiff, a little bit more stable, whilst you can see other areas of the setup, such as the geometry, the transmission differential, and the aero. Those are a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more pointy. So you want it to be nice and stable here. So when you're turning into a corner, it's not going to over-rotate. There's not going to be too much load on the tyre where it simply can't handle the grip. So if you're going into a corner and you find that it is understeering a little bit too much on the front, instead of maybe changing the wings, you could simply just lower this on the front. So as soon as you turn in, there's just going to be a little bit more response. But as always, if there's a bit more response, a bit more rotation, there's more chance of an oversteer moment, and it might be a little bit harder to control. So if you want a bit more on the front, you lower it. If you want a little bit more on the rear, part of the car, a little bit more grip, then you can simply lower this. So that's really how that works in a nutshell. With the the anti-roll bar, works exactly the same way. However, I would describe that it's working kind of different areas of the corner. So the suspension is more about on the entry, when you're actually entering the corner. As soon as you turn the wheel, these are the effects you feel. For the roll bar, this is more about during the corner, how it changes direction, can it handle that load on that tyre. Typically, you always want the rear anti-roll bar to pretty much be on 1. This is what I always see. And with this here, I don't really go often that much higher than 10 or 15 on the front anti-roll bar, because the lower you go down, the more traction you have, the better over the curves it be. It's just, if you can try running it as low as possible, that's really the most ideal. When it comes to the ride height, typically you want to be running this between 30 and 40. You don't really want to be running lower than 30 or any higher than 40. And this kind of structure here, I always like to run the front ride height lower than the rear ride height. And I typically don't really like to have any more than 5 clicks difference between them. So I would only really have maybe 38 as the absolute biggest distance between them. But typically I like to have 3 to 5 clicks between them. And with the ride height, it's really the lower you go down, the more response that you're going to have with the car, the more downforce, but it will be slightly worse over the curbs. So that's why I always recommend to be going above 30, between 30 and 40. Too high, it's going to be a little bit skittish, a little bit too stable at times, not enough rotation. Too low is going to be too bad over the curves, and there might be too much rotation. I don't think the ride height really works that accurately in the game itself, but really the higher you go, the better over the bumps, the more stability you have. And yeah, this is really what I recommend when it comes to the ride height. With the brakes, pretty much always 100% pressure. The only exceptions would be perhaps tracks like Monaco or Baku, because they're very bumpy and they're street circuits. With the front brake bias, really it could be anywhere between, I'd say, 52, 53, up to all the way to 57%. I wouldn't really go above 57%, because then you're not going to get as much rotation when you're using the brakes, when you're trail braking, even with or without ABS. So I think a pretty good sweet spot is 155, 156%. If you're suffering a little bit of rear locking, you're losing the rears as you're braking into a corner, then you can simply just increase this brake pressure, which will mean you can slow the car down quicker, but you will be a little bit more susceptible to locking up. So this is something I really do recommend playing around with. Typically from a time trial setup, I always run probably 1 brake bias higher when it comes to racing online, because you have tyre wear, tyre temperatures to factor in as well. With the tyre pressures, This is something that is quite a big thing on this game, and to explain this as best as I possibly can, the higher the pressure equals more heat, but it does mean you will have more high-speed grip, but it does also mean you will have less low-speed grip, aka mechanical grip. And this is why quite often in time trials where the tire temperatures are locked into place, you see these running quite high because you're going to have quite good high-speed grip. Don't really have to worry about the tire temperatures or anything like that, or tire wear. But when you come to race online, obviously with those factors considered in, you do see the pressures lowered slightly, because you really optimally want to have the tires between 98 to 105 degrees in Fahrenheit. I think that's 205 Fahrenheit for Americans out there. But yeah, that's kind of the range you really want to try and hit. So the lower the pressure, the less heat it will generate. However, the less high speed grip it will have, so it might be a little bit more lethargic and lazy turning into the high speed. However, the more low speed mechanical grip it will have. And again, that's why there isn't so much as a perfect setup, because you can change many different areas of the setup to get the balance you want. It depends which change kind of really feels best for you and where it's actually affecting the car. So you really got to try and imagine it as an orchestra, like you're playing in a band as much as possible. These are really just my recommendations. I think going a time trial is going to give you quite a good baseline to play with. Make sure you try and memorize how these parts of the setup actually work, and it really is about you going and trial and error and seeing what works for you. But I wouldn't try and make things far too stable, because try and get used to a time trial set first. If you can get within 2 seconds of the guy who's got that world record using it, then you know you're executing the fundamentals, and then you can make some accurate changes from there. But I know this video has probably gone a little bit longer than I wanted, but there are a lot of parts to this set to explain. Please let me know if this was useful for you, and I'll be catching you very, very soon. Peace.